All right. So we're starting this new kind of format of being online and virtual. So it's kind of exciting, but also we're going to hit some like technical snags along the way. So appreciate your patience as we figure this out. But last Bible study series that we did was on the life of David, and we did it over eight or 9 weeks. And we covered it in depth. We're not going to take go into that much depth with the life of Solomon, but we are going to really look at the wisdom of Solomon, or what Solomon is most known for is his wisdom. Because one of the most common, themes or requests or questions that people ask me, and I'm sure as many, priests or, comes up, or it's frequently a theme for a retreat, is how do I know the will of God in my life, right? It's one of everybody's always looking for this, right? We're always wondering it, and we always ask the question, how do I know, what does God want in my life? How do I know his will? And when we look at this question, right, and I want to unpack this question together, is, there's a lot of things that are implied when we just ask this question, right? And so if we break it apart, like, how do I know the will of God in my life? What's implied is that there's confusion. There's naturally, if I'm asking the question is coming from a place of confusion, not of clarity. If there was clarity, there'd be no need for the question. But because of the confusion, then we need to find clarity, right? So that's implied in the question. The other thing that's implied when we look at this is that we're implying that God's will is present and it's knowable, right? Because if it wasn't knowable, or if it wasn't present, if his will wasn't present in my life, then again, I would have no need to ask the question. But because his will is knowable and it is present in my life, whether I'm able to see it or not, or discern it or not, irrespective, right? But it is knowable and it is present. And the other thing is that it's unique. It's unique because his will in my life is going to be different than his will in your life, right? Because if it wasn't, then it would be great. Give me the template of God's will in your life and let me apply it in my life, right? It would be so much easier. But it's unique, right? So whenever we ask this question, when we're trying to understand, wisdom, the question that we ask is how do I know his will in my life, right? And so when we think about wisdom with respect to this question, wisdom is then going to help us answer these questions. So kind of working backward, it's going to help us sort through the confusion, right? It's going to help us identify, God's voice amidst all the other voices in life, right? And then the most important is that wisdom is going to kind of, the completion of it is the practical application. Wisdom for us, it's not theoretical. There's a practical application. And we've actually everybody's been around somebody where you see wisdom in their action, right? One of the ways that we can identify wisdom is when you're looking at somebody, you're like, that's a smart move, right? I wouldn't have thought of that, right? That's something that makes us or helps us identify wisdom. So wisdom has this kind of at the very end of it, there's an application, there's a practical step to take. All right, so when we look at wisdom, all right, I was looking up and I came across this. It comes from the OCA spirituality volumes, and it had a nice definition where it was saying that it's the immediate insight into things, the practical understanding and grasping of what is true and right in its living expression and form. Right, I'm going to read it one more time. Wisdom is the immediate insight into things, the practical understanding and grasping of what is true and right in its living expression and form. I thought it was a nice definition because when we put ourselves or find ourselves in a situation where gosh, I need advice or I need insight into this, right? What we're more or less searching for is wisdom. And St. Paul had a very similar um, description of wisdom. And if you want to look it up, it's Ephesians chapter 1, and it's 17 and 18. I'll read it here. And this is Ephesians chapter 1, 17 through 18. It says, that the God of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of glory, may give to you a spirit of wisdom and of revelation in the knowledge of him. I pray that the eyes of your heart may be enlightened, so that you will know what is the hope of his calling, what are the richness of the glory of his inheritance in the saints. Right? So that it's really like verse 18, which is really, it captures a lot of the elements that we've talked about so far with respect to wisdom. It says, I pray that the eyes of your heart may be enlightened, right? So, that's sorting out of the confusion. Eyes of your heart may be enlightened, so that you will know what is the hope of his calling. So discerning like right from wrong, discerning like good from evil, all right? And what are the richness of his glory, riches of the glory of his inheritance. So like that application is in like, okay, the steps that we're going to take to mention it, right? So that's kind of a picture of wisdom. Give you there's another like beautiful verse that again captures this idea of wisdom. And if we go back to when Zacharias, the father of John the Baptist, was in the altar, and the angel Gabriel came and said, announce not when they're in the altar, but after the birth of John the Baptist, when Zacharias' tongue was loosed, he then began to prophesy. And so in Luke chapter 1, verse 79, he says this. He says, to shine upon those, he's talking about the coming of the Lord, right? And what will happen when the Lord comes, right? So this is Luke chapter 1, verses 79. He says, to shine upon those who sit in darkness and in the shadow of death, to guide our feet into the way of peace, right? To shine upon those who sit in darkness and the shadow of death, to guide our feet into the way of peace, right? So again, like when you look at this verse, shine upon those who sit in darkness, right? There's confusion in darkness, right? When are we most likely to trip at home? At night when we're getting up and it's dark. That's when we trip. And when are people in life going to make the worst decisions? In darkness, right? When there's nothing to like help us see clearly. And then the kind of the practical part of wisdom is to guide our feet into the way of peace. So there's that application. And this is why, like I was sharing at the beginning, is saying wisdom isn't theoretical. It's not like a philosophical conversation, right? It hinges on the application of what is internally realized. So wisdom hinges on the application of what is internally realized. All right. Any thoughts or questions on just kind of getting a better grasp of wisdom? Yeah.
What if you don't have the capacity to apply it, but understand it, or like can one be wise without any action? Because according to this definition, wisdom is contingent.
Okay.
On
the realization of wisdom.
The realization
comes in the application. Of wisdom.
You can understand and know wisdom.
Okay. So let me
just some comments.
No, that's fine. But let me put it back.
Can you repeat the question?
The question
or the comment?
So the comment, if I could summarize it, is can someone be wise without the application element of wisdom? Like, can they know like what should happen, but not like apply it, and would they still be wise? Yeah, I'll kind of open it up.
Sometimes you know something is bad for you.
Okay.
You're wise. You know that you're right. No, seriously.
Fair enough. I agree.
You know something is bad for you.
Yeah.
You should or ought to be doing.
Yeah.
You don't do it.
Okay.
So maybe wisdom is there, but discipline is there. I'm not sure.
Would that open up? It's a good question.
Would you-
I feel like the wisdom part is the action part, that's from what I understand. It's like if you're wise, it means like you can be smart and not do what you know is right, but the wisdom is having, this- I think it includes the discipline part. That's what I'm under the impression of.
I think there are multiple levels to it, right? Like you can know it's bad for you and then do it anyway. You can know it's bad for you and avoid whatever triggers you. You can know it's bad for you. Just have the discipline, have that drive the discipline for you to like say no to whatever is bad for you. So I think it's not off and on. I think it's continuum, and you can be more wise or less wise.
I think that's the difference with knowledge and wisdom.
Mm.
Like who's more knowledgeable than the devil, the prince of this world?
I like what Raif said about wisdom being a continuum.
Go ahead, sir.
Oh,
Say
I
it.
said I liked what Raif said about wisdom being a continuum.
Hmm.
It's not like there or not there. So I think there's a part of that. And I would just be curious about how this applies, like when we look at the life of Solomon, because we know that God granted him wisdom, but clearly he applied it at a certain point in his life and then began to falter. So anyway, just a thought.
Thank you. George? Oh, you're going to say something similar? Okay. You stole George's thoughts. All right. So it's in, like, I would agree. I think there is a difference between knowledge and wisdom. Like you're talking about, like, to know what's right and wrong. But just because somebody knows what's right and wrong, would you qualify that individual as being wise? Like they knew, if somebody came at the end of a disaster and says like, oh man, I knew that was not the right decision. Would you then look at the end of the disaster and say like, you're such a wise guy? You would have a hard time like kind of awarding the individual wisdom because they knew what was right or wrong, but they failed to apply it, right? And you're not going to go and seek insight from that person. You want to go and seek insight from the person who knew what was right and wrong, but then applied it, right? And that's why, like, you know, when we're young and maybe like high school and middle school, and like you teach the kids, you're like, don't do this, it's not going to go well. Do this, it's going to go well, right? Are they able to apply it? They may know it, but they can't apply it, right? So that's where I would say like wisdom kind of cuts off, right? Or it's hard to apply and say, yes, you're wise just because you know, because it's really in the application, right? Which is why like Solomon, as we'll see, like he was awarded wisdom, but he didn't always apply wisdom. Okay. All right. Good question.
I think wisdom involves also, action and decision making, sort of like when, well, I think it was Solomon, when two women were fighting over the same child. It was a decision he made that showed his wisdom. I think when he said like, okay, we'll cut the child in half, and you can each have half of the child.
Exactly.
So-
We'll look at that at the end. We're going to look at that story at the end, Mary, but you're spot on, like where it really comes into the kind of the execution of it.
Exactly. Yeah.
No pun intended with the story we're about to read. Good. All right. So now that we've kind of unpacked wisdom a little bit, all right, we're going to go and see how Solomon rises to the throne. And there's a lot that happens, and we're not going to look at all the details of it. What I do want to go is to when David is on his deathbed, and this is actually one chapter back in 1 Kings chapter 2. Right, David's on his deathbed, and he is essentially enthroning Solomon, and he is giving him like his last bit of advice, right? And he gave a lot of advice. We're going to highlight verses 3 and 4. Chapter 2, verses 3 and 4. Somebody has it. Can you read it?
And keep the charge of the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, to keep his statutes, his commandments, his judgments, and his testimonies, as it is written in the law of Moses, that you may prosper in all that you do and wherever you turn. The Lord may fulfill his word which he spoke concerning me, saying, if your son take heed to their ways, to walk before me in truth with all their heart and with all their souls, he said, you shall not lack a man on the throne of Israel.
Okay, right. So this is like what David is saying. And the key part is really in verse 3, where he's saying, like, keep charge of the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, to keep his statutes, his commandments, his ordinances, his testimonies, according to what is written in the law of Moses, that you may succeed in all that you do wherever you turn. Right? And so when we look at this and we see the law of Moses, the law of Moses was something that was divinely revealed, right? It was given by God to the Israelites. And so there's a divine element to the law of Moses. And when we look at it from that perspective, we can probably agree that it carried wisdom, right? Because the law of Moses was challenging the Israelites to live in a starkly different way than everybody else around them, right? Every other nation around them believed in many gods, and all of a sudden the law of Moses was telling them to proclaim one God, which was totally revolutionary in the Old Testament. Now, yes, we all look and see like monotheistic religions, okay? But in the time of the Old Testament, what the law of Moses was doing is saying, like, you will worship the Lord your God and only him shall you worship. It was so revolutionary. And then when you add on top of that all these different things of like, how do we treat our brothers? How do we treat slaves? How do we treat, different people in different situations? Like, there was wisdom in it. How do we right a wrong against a brother? So there was wisdom in the law of Moses. And so when we also look historically, like jumping ahead, like, when did the Israelites always get in trouble? When they disregarded the law. That's when they, another nation came in, they were, they lost in battle, different things happened when they disregarded the law of Moses. And so there was wisdom in the law of Moses, and David is telling Solomon, right? This is just like we were talking about with, like, when you teach your Sunday school kids, like, when you pray, we need to read the Bible, and they're like, yeah, okay, right? And then we get into our adult years, and we're like, oh, what is saying, like, we need to pray and read the Bible. We're like, yeah, okay. It's like that same idea, right? David was urging Solomon not to depart from the wisdom that was being revealed through the law. Right? And he knew that it was going to be enticing to deviate. If we were to fast forward, we would see so many different kings in the Old Testament deviate from the law of Moses and forget the law of Moses, and that's when it all went downhill. Right? So David is urging him to hold on to the wisdom that has been revealed. All right, now let's jump ahead. And he gives them a lot more advice. And he goes, and for the rest of chapter 2, Solomon does like an upheaval of the administration, and he pretty much changes the cabinet, so to speak. Right? And if we go to chapter 3, we start to get insight into, how Solomon is living. And if somebody can read verses, 1 Kings chapter 3, verse 2 through 4.
Meanwhile, the people sacrificed at the high places, because there was no house built for the name of the Lord until those days. And Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of his father David, except that he sacrificed and burnt incense at the high places. Now the king went to Gibeon to sacrifice there, for that was the great high place. Solomon offered 1,000 burnt offering on that altar.
All right. So we get a little like window into what's happening early on in Solomon's reign as king. And so verse 2, when he's saying the people were still sacrificing in high places because there's no house built for the name of the Lord. Pretty much just saying like, pretty much saying that the tabernacle, right, was still outside of Jerusalem. David brought the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem, but the tabernacle, where the altar and the all the different things, I'm blanking right now, but the tabernacle where they would actually offer the sacrifices was still outside of Jerusalem, right? Which was one of the biggest impetuses for why David wanted to build the temple, but he was told, no, you can't, right? And your son will build it, is because they would still had to travel to make sacrifices. I have a map here. Maybe, I don't know how well everybody can see it, but pointed out. So here's Bethlehem, and when we see Bethlehem, here we always know Jerusalem is like 2 miles away. Gibeon is right up here, and so between about Jerusalem and Gibeon, it's about 7 months. All right. So in those days, for a king to offer 1,000 animals, it was not a small hike, right? This was like a huge excursion to go. And what that does is it gives us a little bit of insight into Saul's desire to follow what David was saying is don't depart from the law of Moses, right? So he's making the effort, right?
Sorry,
Yeah.
so the high places are a good thing. I thought those were the idols.
High place at this time is okay,
Okay.
because it's where the tabernacle was, right? But what should have happened is that once the temple was built, high places should have been taken down. And what became the Achilles heel is that the high places were never taken down until very, very late with all the kings. And then the next king, like after, I can't remember, it was like either Josiah or the king after him, they took down the high places, and then the next king put them back up, right? So it was like a short victory, and then they blew it, okay? So that's a good point. So right now it's okay because there's no temple. And because we haven't split the kingdom. We're still in one kingdom. And it was when the kingdoms were split that the 10 tribes to the north, what they did was they built high places, right? To stop the Israelites from going all the way down to Jerusalem, because they don't want them to cross into Jerusalem and the kingdom of Judea, because they're like, well, we don't want them to go and then stay. Right, so we built high places at the northern part of the northern kingdom and the southern part of the northern kingdom in order to keep people worshiping within the northern kingdom, right? So that's where we are with David, or sorry, with Solomon. This is what he's doing. And so now he's in Gibeon and he's sacrificing. And it's while he is sacrificing that we see this request for wisdom. Right, this narrative of the request of wisdom, which is going to come in verses 5 through 9. If somebody has it up, we're going to read 1 Kings chapter 3, 5 through 9. Even people online, you guys can read too, because we hear you loud and clear.
Sure, I can read it. In Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream at night, and God said, "Ask what you wish me to give you." Then Solomon said, "You have shown great loving kindness to your servant David, my father, according as he walked before you in truth and righteousness and uprightness of heart toward you. And you have reserved for him this great loving kindness, that you have given him a son to sit on his throne, as it is this day. Now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of my father David. Yet I am but a little child. I do not know how to go out or come in. Your servant is in the midst of your people, which you have chosen, a great people who are too many to be numbered or counted. So give your servant an understanding heart to judge your people, to discern between good and evil. For who is able to judge this great people of yours?
Okay, thank you. So we unpacked wisdom at the very beginning. Now I want you to, like, in these verses, pick out elements that are kind of coming into this understanding of wisdom. So what do you see in this narrative that highlights kind of this pathway or elements that are important for wisdom?
An understanding that you currently lack wisdom.
Awesome.
Yeah.
In order to know you need wisdom, you got to know that you don't have wisdom.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Humility.
So we'll call that humility. Perfect.
He acknowledged the fact that, God showed mercy to David because he walked before you. Like he says, because he walked before you in truth and righteousness and in uprightness of heart with you, you have continued this great kindness for him. So he recognizes that it was like it was granted to David all this greatness because he walked in the way of the Lord.
So there's there's a certain behavior or code of conduct that is necessary for wisdom, right? So you're not going to all of a sudden take wisdom and not apply it in like a context that doesn't match, right? So there's a conduct, or a way of life that is associated with wisdom.
So making good judgment.
Good. So you're right. So again, like that ability to discern between good and evil, right? Sort through the confusion, look deep into the situation. These are elements of wisdom, right?
I think he had the right motives too, because he wanted this wisdom to serve God and his people. So that's what it is.
So good motives. So he wanted to do a good job, right? Be a good steward of the responsibility given to him. Anything else?
He kind of made it God's problem.
Okay.
It's like they're your people. Like,
True.
give me wisdom or give me grace, or in order to help you, help me, help me, help you. Yeah.
Help me help you. Fair enough. He did. I think we also see that kind of the application element where he's saying like to judge, right? It's taking the wisdom, but not just to have the wisdom, but the fullness of wisdom is in the judgment and like making sure I say yes to what should say yes to and no to what I should say no to. So that that final piece of wisdom is really like, can you pull the trigger? The other thing that I do want to point out is I like where he says in verse 9, says, so give your servant an understanding heart, right? And when you look at the word understanding and you look at the Hebrew word, which is shama, right? It means to hear or listen. And it's nice because it brings, this, if there's going to be understanding, there must be a desire to listen. If we don't want to listen, then there isn't going to be understanding. So it's interesting that like it's translated out for us understanding, but that understanding is hinging on our ability to listen, which then asks like, okay, well, in what situations am I putting myself in order to listen? Like, am I in the right place or the right time or in the right environment to listen to the right things? Because if I'm not listening to the right things, then it's going to affect the judgment that I bring forth. And so a key part for us too, when we think about this is like, am I listening? in order to gain the insight or the internal illumination in order to piece through what is confusing inside, right? So I need to be listening. All right. So let's go. Let's read 1 Kings, read 10 through 13. And this is the response of God to Solomon. Okay. So 1 Kings chapter 3, verse 10 through 13.
The speech pleased the Lord that Solomon had asked this thing. Then God said to him, because you have asked this thing and have not asked long life for yourself, nor have asked riches for yourself, nor have asked the life of your enemies, but have asked for yourself understanding to discern justice, behold, I have done according to your words. See, I have given you a wise and understanding heart, so that there has not been anyone like you before you, nor shall any like you arise after you. And I have also given you what you have not asked, both riches and honor, so that there shall not be anyone like you among the kings all your days.
Mm-hmm. So what do you notice about God's response?
Exceedingly abundantly more than you.
Yeah. It's like, it's great. Like, you didn't take like the road that most kings would take, right? But I'm going to give you what you asked for, and then like add on top of that all the things, that you didn't pursue after, and it's such a beautiful picture, because there's so many opportunities like in our lives, and where we can easily be greedy, thinking that we'll get what we want, but we end up with like nothing. Or we can like be sacrificial, and then what we ultimately find in our sacrifice is fulfillment. And so I'll just share, like, I was actually in the middle of reading this book on marriage, and it was just talking about this same concept, and how in marriage it's very easy to want to pursue after like your own desires, right? This is what I want, and this is my pursuit right now, and I need this time, and I want this person, because of how I feel in response to them. Like, when we do that in serious relationships in our lives, like, we end up like with nothing at the end, long term, because it's all selfish, right? There's no fulfillment, there's no intimacy, and there's no value to the relationship. But when an individual sacrifices for their spouse, then what they find is that intimacy. What they find is value in the relationship. What they find is the commitment of love, rather than the pursuit of just like kind of these fleeting emotions, right? When I'm very self-centered in my actions, right? And so, just like Solomon did, like, I'm going to give up all these things because I want to be a good king. And God said, okay, you'll be a good king, and I'll give you this, right? So it's a beautiful picture, right? But that picture is always contingent on one thing. What's verse 14? I'll read it. If you walk in my ways, keeping my statutes and commandments as your father David walked, then I will prolong your days. Right? So it's a big if. Like, even though he was granted wisdom, right? It was contingent. I think you were making this point, John, like on how he was going to walk, right? That it wasn't just going to be like wisdom regardless of how he walks. It was wisdom as a result of how he walks, right? Which is essential to us understanding wisdom, right? Wisdom is found in obedience to God, right? Without this fundamental desire to be obedient to his commandments, then the ability to see and act on what is revealed, by wisdom isn't going to be there, right? So I say again, if we don't have a fundamental desire to be obedient to his commandments, then our ability to act, right, based on what is revealed to us will not be there. And that's the difference of what we were saying earlier. Like, can you just know it and not act and still call it wisdom? No. Right? Because wisdom is about the application of what is revealed, about the clarity that is brought to life, and how do I carry it through? Yeah.
Question.
Yeah.
How does this align with the concept of like the prosperity gospel? Because I know we don't believe in the prosperity gospel.
Yeah. So the prosperity gospel, I haven't read too much on it, but my basic go ahead.
I was just gonna say like basically the concept of like if you're good, you're gonna be rich, like, or you're gonna have everything you want.
Yeah.
Like if you're a good Christian, you abide by all the laws, the whole concept of just you're given according to how much good you do.
That's not Christian, that's not a Coptic.
It's not.
It's not orthodox by any
It's not an
stretch.
Orthodox belief, okay.
It's not.
No, it's
But like, there's a lot of churches that say that, and then like stuff like this verse, they'll use it and say like, well, here you go. Solomon asked and he was given, and there's a contingent here saying, if you keep my ways, you'll keep having.
the thing is,
Right. This became very popular through Joel Osteen and
Yeah.
other, that are really focused on the prosperity gospel.
So when you look at like our understanding of the following of his commands, like, and if I could kind of fast forward us to, present day, or not present day, but even just like crossing the threshold of the New Testament, and we look at the life of the apostles, right? They followed him, but what did their following look like? Right? They were shipwrecked, they were stoned, they were thrown out, they were seen as fools, right? What prosperity, like how does that line up with what the prosperity gospel is proclaiming? That you'll have riches. They gave up the riches, right? For ultimately the ultimate richness of heaven. So they sacrificed. It was a sacrificial life. So that's where like I would say, there's a key difference with respect to the prosperity gospel and this, right? Just because like, any of us like follow the commands doesn't mean like life is going to be rich and glamorous. When we follow his command and we follow where he leads us, it's going to be tough. What did Christ say? Like foxes have holes, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. That's incompatible with the prosperity gospel. So
I guess
Sorry.
to your point, sorry, I'm just challenging you.
it's okay.
Is this kind of like, how in the Old Testament things are more literal, and that's why God gave him like riches, but in the New Testament, we get heavenly riches instead?
It could be also that even if you are good, you may have a good, like it may be possible that you do good and you're moral.
Sure.
And you.
But it's that uncertainty.
It's an uncertainty. So like it may be possible. Yeah, maybe you do good and you are blessed materially.
Right.
I guess it just doesn't necessarily mean because you are that everyone will be that way. That doesn't mean you were blessed materially because you were good. I don't know.
But
I
even
think that, sorry.
Go ahead.
Mom. I think also there is a difference between the way God interacted with his people in the Old Testament versus the way he interacts with us now. And I think that I'm not going to express this well, but I've heard this many times expressed that, our faith is very much like the whole story of faith since the beginning of time and has developed into what we know it to be now. So God was sort of like, through the law, tutoring his people to, starting with an eye for an eye, and kind of, I guess, an action has a particular consequence. And we see that through the law of Moses. Whereas that's not the substance of our faith now. It has reached a higher level than that. I'm not expressing this well, but I think that this kind of, if you do X, then you get Y, is sort of it's a more limited faith, if you will.
Mhm. Thank John, you had,
I was just gonna say, I guess this goes back to just your earlier point of God's will, and it doesn't like, it's not like a
one size fits
fill in
all.
the blank, one size fits all. Like maybe God's will for somebody like Solomon, if you walk in my way, you'll receive this.
Mhm.
But, like,
I mean,
but then it goes back to like confusing, right? I'm just challenging back to your earlier point of God's will,
mhm.
right? It doesn't necessarily mean that God's will for everybody is to do well if they walk according to his way,
No, absolutely.
or to have wisdom if
And
they walk.
even to that point, like when God gives, generously material goods to anybody, there's a huge responsibility that comes with that. Because also, like with the material good comes that like slippery slope, right? And that individual has to be extremely vigilant. How is that individual going to be vigilant without really striving to walk in his ways, right? And to look for his commands and to seek after wisdom to know, well, how am I going to be a good steward of what has been given to me? So we can't just say like, oh, you'll have this. Like if you do this and you act good, you'll have this, and it's going to be, peachy and nice. No, like this comes with a huge responsibility, and you have to be careful. You have to be vigilant about what is happening inside your heart, because Solomon had a lot, and man, at the end, he made a lot of mistakes, and he blew it. He started off as a good king, but like towards the end, we see a life, lacking the wisdom that he was granted. And so nothing comes just like easy. It comes with a huge responsibility and challenge. But I mean, I think to our conversation, if we kind of liken the law of Moses to our current day spiritual practices, that we continually challenge ourselves to grow in with prayer and scripture and fasting and almsgiving, all these different like spiritual practices. If we kind of liken them, and we look today and we say like, well, the church continues to impress on us the importance and the value of these spiritual practices. Why? Because these spiritual practices lead to an internal illumination, right? There is a divine light that comes in to our lives, to our minds, to our hearts through these spiritual practices. And it's kind of, that becomes the gateway for wisdom, because it's only when there's that internal illumination that all of a sudden can we begin to piece through like all the confusing mess that is inside of us. We're able to look inside and discern and say, this looks like a dead end in life. I need not go that route. Like, even though this job opportunity looks good, like it's going to consume my time and my energy. I'm not going to take it, because I'm going to value these relationships. I'm going to value being able to serve. I'm going to value different things, right? So it's only through our spiritual practices that we find this internal illumination, which then allows us to see and sift through what is confusing in our minds and our hearts, and begin to see where God is leading and where he is not leading, right? But our problem is that we tend to want to skip the practices and we just want the wisdom, right? And it just doesn't work like that, because the wisdom comes through that divine illumination, which comes through the spiritual practices, right? And you kind of need that process to eventually reach the wisdom. And then you're going to need God's like strength and his grace to actually pull the trigger and do what's right.
So can we say like some wisdom begets additional wisdom?
For sure.
Like as you grow wiser and wiser, like
Yeah.
yeah,
Like there's a continuum. The fullness
Yeah.
of wisdom is Jesus Christ.
yeah, and okay,
So we will grow in wisdom,
wisdom begets.
you know. But foolishness begets foolishness too. And that's the problem, right? Right? Wisdom leads to wisdom because when we make a wise decision that is not easy, it puts us in a different like situation in life. But lo and behold, like just a few steps down the road, there's going to be another challenge. And we will need greater wisdom, but it will build off of what we've learned already. Great questions. All right. Now that we've kind of like talked about wisdom, we will see this example of wisdom in the story of which we kind of referenced earlier on. And I'm going to go ahead and summarize a bit of the story, and then we'll kind of see how Solomon reacts. So there's a story that's presented to us in chapter 3, and it's verses 16 through 28, which is a story. And the story is of two women who are harlots, and they both delivered 3 days apart. And modern medicine has not like reached them by this time, and they were co-sleeping, right? Which we know isn't good. And while they were co-sleeping, one child died. Okay, and when the mother realized in the middle, she went and she took her dead child, put it in place of the living child, and then took the living child back to her bed. Right, so she swapped it. And then in the morning, the woman woke up, saw that her child had died, and started to wonder what happened, and examine the child, and then realize no, this isn't my baby. And so now you have these two women who are saying you took my child in the middle of the night, and she's like, no, this is my child, you killed your child. So it's a confusing situation. And when you look back then, there's no DNA testing, they were harlots, so knowing who the father wasn't going to be part of the picture. So you're really just dealt with a very, very confusing situation. And so they came to Solomon to sort through it. And if we look at verses 23 and 25, okay, verses 23 and 25, we'll see how Solomon deals with it. It says, then the king said, the one says, this is my son who is living, and your son is the dead one. And the other says, no, for your son is the dead one, and my son is the living one. So Solomon's sitting on the throne and just kind of summarizing everything, right? Then the king said, get me a sword. So they brought a sword before the king. The king said, divide the living child in two and give half to the one and half to the other, right? So this is the best solution ever, right? Clearly, wisdom at its finest, right? But the beauty comes in the response, right? And this is where we see wisdom. And remember how we were describing wisdom is there was immediate insight into the situation, right? So he's dealing with a situation that just a physical appearance, there's no way anybody can say this is your child, this is not your child, right? So he has to go deeper into the situation, right? Verses 26 and 28, where it says, then the woman whose child was the living one spoke to the king, for she was deeply stirred over her son and said, oh my lord, give her the living child and by no means kill him. But the other said, he shall be neither mine nor yours, divide him. Then the king said, give the first woman the living child and by no means kill him. She is the mother. And when all Israel heard of the judgment which the king had handed down, they feared the king, for they saw that the wisdom of God was in him to administer justice. Right? So we see a lot of the elements of wisdom coming through. And in this first situation where we have captured for us after he was granted wisdom, it's an external situation in which he has to look, deep into in order to come out with the right justice, right? But it had to do with pulling the trigger. It's kind of a bold thing to say, give me a sword and cut the child, right? It takes takes some courage to say that and to know like what you're looking for, right? But that's wisdom. That's wisdom. That's the fruition of wisdom. It's a manifestation of wisdom, right? But the challenge for Solomon, which we'll see in the next couple of weeks, is can he have the same insight internally? Right? It's one thing to look externally and to administer judgment. But can we look internally and piece through everything and then administer judgment, right? A self-regulating judgment. So that's the challenge that we're going to see with Solomon going forward. Any last questions or thoughts? Great. This is great. Thank you, everybody. We'll pray together and then we'll conclude for today.
Buena, sorry, just one thing. I'm sorry. I just I do think that the conversation about prosperity gospel is worth going back to at some point, because it is something that is very dangerous and I think definitely permeates, without realizing our belief system. And it is really, I think, like kind of goes to the problem of pain too, and people wondering like, why is this happening to me? What is God doing? Is God punishing me? And I think, just a lot of those ideas have to do with ideas similar to the prosperity gospel. So anyway, just throwing that out there. I'm still sort of thinking about it, even though we left it behind, but it is a big issue that I at a certain point in my life started reading certain books that I came to realize were really problematic, because that was kind of the underpinning of a lot of what it was teaching.
I think, just as we're talking about it, like more things are coming to my mind. And I think like one of the biggest holes in the prosperity gospel is it fails to answer the question, like when God doesn't give, right? That's, it is all about like prosperity, prosperity, prosperity. But we know that the hand of God at times withholds, right? In order to teach, in order to course correct. And in the prosperity gospel, to my knowledge, has no response for that. And so it what it does is it has an incomplete answer to the condition of life, right? To all the factors of life. It can't answer the problem of pain. It can't answer the problem of suffering, because it is so focused on, if you will, the positive direction, that the blind side of it is in the negative.
Well, I think the answer to the problem of pain is that it's your fault. If you're doing everything right, then you will be prosperous. You must be doing something wrong. Like, there really isn't room for a Job. There's only room for you brought this upon yourself.
Sure, but one of the tests for anything, for it to be true, it has to be relevant and relatable to reality. And the reality of life is that there are people who are living righteous lives, but like are dealing with a tremendous amount of suffering. And so if the prosperity gospel is unable to offer any sort of cohesive or coherent answer to it, then you have to challenge it on its foundation. Because if you leave out certain gaps, of reality, like of the person who is good, but who is suffering, right? And your only answer is like, well, you're not good enough. Like it lacks it fails in one of the tests on whether or not it can be true. I don't know if that makes sense.
You're right, but
Yeah.
you're absolutely right. The problem is exactly in those people that end up thinking, well, I'm not good enough, so I'm just gonna keep trying harder.
Mhm.
And it's like, you're fine. It's just how it is.
Which,
But there's also something interesting. You said like prosperity, the world says is a blessing, but it could be to your detriment.
it
Like
can.
Lazarus and the poor man, like you could
The
have a
rich
lot-
man
yeah,
had
the
a
rich
lot,
man,
yeah.
the rich man and Lazarus,
Hmm.
like those extra prosperity, if you will, could be your absolute spiritual,
Yeah.
disaster. Like the love of money is,
The root of all evil.
yeah, and
Absolutely.
greed and then pride come in and like all this other stuff.
But there's so many people nowadays driven away from the church because of the underlying concept of prosperity gospel. Well,
Yeah.
I was good. I read. I prayed.
Yeah.
I attended liturgy. I had
Mhm.
confession, but God gave me this, and this.
Mhm.
The underlying thought here
Yeah.
is, if I pray and I do everything right, therefore my life should be perfect.
Mhm.
Oh, that's not truth.
Yeah.
But there's an underlying thought always in a lot of people's head of this concept of
Mhm.
prosperity gospel, that if I do everything right, if I do everything by the book,
Or why does good things happen to bad
yeah,
people?
or even, that's even worse. I hate that.
Yeah. But then, I guess one thing to answer that is like, where's like, by this standard, like God is indebted to us, right? Like, is God in debt to me just because of the good things? And it's certainly not the case. God is not like a genie in a bottle that as I do things, he pays me for it, you know what I mean? So there has to be an understanding of how it's a personal relationship and how God gives grace, but that grace isn't necessarily for materialistic things. Just like the blind man, like it wasn't his fault. Like when they asked him, you know what I mean? Or Lazarus, when Jesus allowed him to die, and then 4 days later raised him up from the dead. So yeah, bad things happen to the people.
But also, like, I mean, when you go into the lives of those who like have lived faithfully but suffered like tragically, these individuals describe the hand of God working in their lives in a way that like none of us like would be able to comprehend. His action in their life and the grace that he provides them to be able to sustain the tragedy and continue to live faithfully is an enormous testimony to the truth of the gospel, which is God will be with us no matter like he is faithful to us when we are unfaithful to him. Like, I mean, even when you look at salvation, he loved us, first, and he loved us while we were still sinners. There was nothing that like we had to do to gain his love. So the prosperity gospel comes in and at its most fundamental level, like violates the truth proclaimed in the gospel, which is, he loved us while we were still sinners, and it was nothing of what we did that we received salvation. So even on that merit alone, like it violates the message of the gospel. So, all right. Good discussion. Very good. All right, I'm gonna stop the recording. We'll pray, and then we'll meet next week, same time.